This video is about how to use Cursor AI for beginners in 2025. In this video, I'm going to talk about what Cursor should and shouldn't be used for, who should use it. I'm going to give my best prompting tips, some of which I don't think you'll hear anywhere else, and that really help dramatically improve the quality and the consistency of your outputs, giving you less bugs. I'm gonna go through some of the interesting settings that Cursor has. I'm gonna do this as fast as possible so that your time's very efficient here. And I'm gonna give some quick sample usage. And I recommend you watch all the way to the end because I do have some unique tips that I haven't heard anybody else talk about yet. So first of all, if you've used VS Code, this is based upon VS Code. And so it's a very easy transition to Cursor from VS Code, so that's good. And by beginner, I mean a beginner to Cursor and not necessarily a beginner to coding. I think it does help to use any of the AI coding tools to actually have coding experience. You know, if you have never coded before, Cursor is still gonna be a bit of a learning curve and there's probably some other better tools for you, but unless you are committed to learning coding, which is a long journey for most people, it's a very different way of thinking about things. But if you are a more experienced coder, just haven't worked in Cursor before, that's probably going to be the person who's going to get the most out of this video and Cursor in general. I still think that you can use Cursor to learn new languages. I used LLMs to help me learn Python, but I had coded in many back-end languages for many years, and so that was a very easy transition. It really sped that process up a lot. I also would say I don't believe the hype around not learning to code. I've heard a lot of BS out there that just does not make sense. I don't think it adds up in a lot of ways. I think the ability to understand how code works, that skill, the value of that skill actually goes up as more software pervades our society. Is there a point sometime in the future where that understanding how to flip switches and how to do zeros and ones or code assembly is no longer valuable? Potentially yes, but I think that we're decades away from that. In fact, as this message gets pushed out there further, I think that skill set becomes more valuable. And by leaning too heavily on these tools, there's a little bit of warning. It can depreciate your skills if you're not doing it with thought. At the same time, it can save you from having to do things that otherwise aren't really very value add, but still would take time. Because believe you me, this can save you a lot of time and can do some awesome stuff. But it can also be used in a way that wastes a lot of time. So if you want to go into the settings, we'll start there. You can go to preferences and you have just the general settings, the profiles, the Cursor settings, the VS Code settings. So we can go in here and do the standard settings. Let's check out the Cursor settings. There is a mode in here, it's in features, that used to be called YOLO mode, but now it's here. I think it'll default to, I think it's ask. If you turn it to agent, it'll kind of allow itself to answer its own questions and take its own actions without getting checklists. I'm not going to go through every single allow or not allow in here, but feel free to go here and make this your own. I generally just turn that on and leave it as is. You can also turn on and off other models, and I don't know why they have Cursor small, Cursor fast. I don't think I'd really want to use DeepSeek. My experiences are not good with that. It'd be weird to turn on GPT-3. Look, GPT-4 API just came out, so they updated that already. Kind of surprised it didn't include O3 Mini because it's supposed to be, I believe it's supposed to be better than O1. And you can also add custom models. This is a way to get around, if we look at their models, so it tends to want to turn on auto select, so it'll constantly turning it back on, I think, to save themselves money. But they've recently added this max for Gemini 2.5 and Claude 3.7 Sonnet. Last I checked, they haven't even updated their pricing page to reflect this, but this is basically where you can pay extra for it to use the full context window, which should help with bigger code bases, because sometimes it does struggle with, if I'm tagging multiple files, it doesn't even always do that correctly, and I'll show you how to do that here in a second. You could also be using Azure or other things. This might actually make your code more secure. I believe they have some additional security settings before sending it to, or different deals that they have, like in a business sense. So that might be a way in which you could code in a little bit more of a secure way. I'm not sure if I would still trust it. Typically, I like to use, right now I use Gemini 2.5 Pro, and I sometimes use thinking and sometimes don't. To be honest, I haven't really found the thinking to be that much better. I think that the model itself right here does a really good job, and it's just a lot faster. And then sometimes if 2.5 Pro isn't working super well, I might try 3.7 or even 3.5. Sometimes 3.5 I think actually does better despite the benchmarks. So, you can try different models. In general, Gemini is better at following instructions. Claude is a bit more creative. So maybe for some front end, if I'm trying to do front end, which I'm not really a front end guy, but if I wanted to whip something up real quickly, I might use Claude instead. And Gemini is faster, so that's useful. You can also do rules. There's a variety of ways to implement this. You can have user rules overall, and then you can have project-specific rules. You can also do a file, add a file in here, .cursor rules file, and then you can just kind of do that without actually coming in here, and it'll actually use those rules. It just throws it into the context window. I don't really do that very much, just because each request I tend to want to have it go in a specific way, but you can see I have a little rule here. I don't really like it to run the command lines, but it doesn't actually follow this rule very well. So you can add your MCP servers here. This is pretty useful, and then they have some beta stuff, which might look different by the time you do it. We could actually change this to early access, so maybe it'll give us some newer stuff. Pros and cons of that. I'll leave it at that to see if some cool stuff comes up. There's supposed to be multiple tabs, but I believe it just, you can show the chat history, and so you can go back through your previous chats if you want. That's really useful to actually go back and look at some previous conversations, because typically you don't want these conversations to go too long, or else it can kind of mess things up. It'll either lose context, or it'll use context from previous questions that maybe are not quite as related in order to answer questions or take things in the wrong direction. At the same time, having some of that additional context is helpful. And what I could do is, there used to have a feature here, but I don't see it anymore. When we switch to ask, and then we could potentially, so it gave me this in about 5 seconds. You could copy and paste this into your next conversation right here. Click this right here. So that would be something you could move to another conversation if you wanted to give it the context. I do like using agent for most of my things that I use, because it does tend to work in a loop, and at first I didn't really like it, but it's gotten a lot better at kind of figuring things out and taking multi-steps. Now you want to be careful with having it do too many steps. I do have a recommendation for this. What you can do is you can create a to-do.md, maybe even put in a sample one, give it a sample to do, and then you can have it like, hey, plan out your actions step by step in the to-do, and then check them off one at a time. And that can kind of keep it on track. It's not perfect, but it'll already kind of do that to some degree, but you can kind of guide it a little bit more if you have a particular way, or if the particular way you want it to go about doing things. Or you could even define your own to-do and spend a lot of time giving it a really specific prompt and have it go one step at a time. Now you can also tag files. So if we have files we want to reference that we're not actually in, we can do that. You can do it there, or you can just do main.py and have it tag something there. You can tag, there's kind of like general documentation. There's some like universal documentation that you can find. You can tag Git. Terminals, I use @web sometimes. I tend to use @web at the same time as when I do a URL, even though if you do just publish a URL in there, it should go ahead and crawl that. Sometimes that's effective, sometimes it's not. So sometimes what I'll still have to do, I'll have it try to use an API, and a lot of time this does work. Every once in a while it doesn't, and so I have to go in and find the actual sample code in the API. I think there's a variety of different reasons why this could happen, where it doesn't actually find the right piece of the information when it's actually crawling. This is not a perfect process. These agents are not perfect, and the more complex situations you're giving it, the more chances there are for failure. The models are getting better, but it's not like they're getting 100 times better every quarter or something. They're getting a little bit better. These models are maybe twice as good, in my experience, as GPT-4 was when it came out 2 years ago. So it has improved, but it's not the difference between GPT-4 was from GPT-3. GPT-3 was not really incredibly useful. It was useful as a coding model, but not nearly as useful as GPT-4. I expect that to even with the reinforcement learning that they keep doing, and with the thinking that does increase the benchmarks, I don't think that the coding tools are going to be perfectly reliable by the end of the year, as a lot of them predict, where they can just be set off to do their own thing. I think you're still going to have to really think about how to go about doing this in a smart way. You have to give it very clear instructions. I would, if you just give it like a couple of lines, sometimes that's okay, but most of the time I spend a lot of time and thought, how do I give it the right information? How do I be really clear? You can even give it redundancy of information. Sometimes when I'm putting in a prompt, I'll kind of approach the instructions from multiple different angles. So you're saying kind of the same thing, but two different ways. Let's be very clear about what we want to do here. A lot of the time what I'll do to save myself time and to reduce errors, I'll actually open up a notepad. This makes it so I don't have to press Shift-Enter every time. Or sometimes I'll accidentally press Enter instead of Shift-Enter, and I'm like, I gotta stop it. I just do this for a lot of things. I think it just simplifies things. It's nice and clean, and I'll do objective, and then something like context, and then instructions. Variations on this, but usually, especially with more complicated situations, more longer instruction sets, I'm gonna say, hey, this is what I'm trying to do. The context tends to be quite a bit longer. It'll give a lot more details about what I want, and then sometimes instructions just accomplish the objective using the context above, or sometimes a little bit more detailed. This does help it, and sometimes what you want to do is you want to refer one to the other. You can attach images here. This is useful in a variety of different ways. So just know that because Gemini and all the top models are multimodal, so they can see the images. Now, if you do have it do some stuff and you're like, I don't want to do that, they do have restore checkpoints without even being connected to Git. You can use this to commit and do stuff to Git. By the way, in the git ignore file, it will intentionally not look at those files. I don't have proof that they don't sometimes look at them, but that's supposedly how it's supposed to work. The most common hotkeys I use is Ctrl+L. I guess it's on Windows, which opens up this thing here. If you use Ctrl+K, it'll actually allow you to do things in line, but I pretty much never use this. And you can do Ctrl+T gets you in here to search for things. Those are the top hotkeys. There's a bunch of different other ones, a little bit beyond the scope of this video to show you all of the possibilities there. Another thing that I'll do with first versions of things, I don't do it as much as I should. Write tests first, then code, then run tests and update the code until the tests pass. That's something I got from somebody else, so I can't take credit for that. Not a super novel idea to say write tests, but that specific line, I think that's really useful. I tend to do a lot of logging debugging, so that's something that is actually even useful for giving the model errors. So I like to have it log not just to the terminal, the command line, but also to a text file. And then I take the logging to another level. One of my favorite and most important things that I think should be done anytime you're working with LLMs within the code, not necessarily in here, but if you're creating an AI-powered application, is to actually store all of the LLM ins and outs as separate text files, date and time stamped with some information in it. You can see here, this is an LLM in call to Gemini 2.0 Flash. This is incredibly useful for debugging, and the AI models themselves are really good at creating and at implementing this within your code. That is incredibly helpful for debugging for me, but also a lot of times if something's going wrong, I can copy and paste that into here to help it figure out what's going on. Especially the more context you can give it, the better. Another thing I do a lot of is I'll have it as one of the steps, I'll have it build a readme.md and a setup.md. Sometimes you don't need the setup.md, and this can be like one of the last steps once they've built everything so that it can help. You don't necessarily have to do this with the initial call, but once it gets to a point where it works, I really like having it do that. Another tip that I got from somebody else, but that I think works really well is sometimes what you'll do, some of the challenges with Cursor and any of the AI platforms is you try to debug something and it gives you the same error over and over again, and it keeps saying, hey, okay, I know what the problem is, and then it doesn't solve it. Hey, I know what the problem is, and doesn't solve it, and you go into a loop. So again, getting more debugging information, sometimes that can solve it. Switching models, sometimes that can solve it. But another good idea I came across, which is switching to ask and having it kind of brainstorm potential solutions, and maybe even giving it the first solutions that it didn't say, it's not this didn't solve it, give me additional ones. Because sometimes it does kind of paint itself into a corner. This is where the restore checkpoints is really useful, because sometimes it fixes an error and it fixes an error and it fixes an error and it creates all this bloat, and that can be an issue. Or what it'll do is there's an error that you debug and fix, and then it recreates it a couple iterations down the line. So one thing that is pretty useful is if there's an error fix or if there's a particular way you want it to do things, put a comment in there saying, this is intentional, I want this to stay. Like it's almost like it's instructions to the model that is fed into the model when it goes to do it. Don't recommend using this for larger code bases. Windsurf is probably gonna be better for that, but even that, all the models still kind of struggle with that, and the bigger the code base, the more complex it is, the more challenges you're gonna have. And that's why actually, even though it's technically bad coding, what I have found is in order to simplify my initial requests, you want it to be in as few files as possible. Yes, technically when you're building something a little bit more complex, I've tried to build a game where I had it with the correct structure, and it had a bunch of different files and a bunch of different folders. It created a whole host of errors. It would do circular imports, but even without that, it confuses the model. And then I was like, you know what? And it actually ended up writing way more code, because there's just a lot more kind of support code that needs to be written versus, okay, just write one index.html file that has the HTML, the CS, and the JavaScript in it, and then one main.py file, and do it all in those two files. The reliability goes way up. I like to use vanilla JavaScript. I've seen a lot of people do 3JS, or I haven't seen a lot of people try React with this. Personally, I'm not a big JavaScript person, so I do vanilla JavaScript to keep it as simple as possible, but it doesn't look as nice. So, maybe take that for what you will. A lot of times when I'm starting a project, I'll actually start again in a text file, and I'll just have starting instructions where I just kind of brainstorm it outside of Cursor in a text file. I think it's just a little bit easier, and you can see some of what I have done here. Although this has a little bit of a conversation that I had before with a previous one. So this is actually more like a version 8 of this. And so what I can do is I can just have it execute starting instructions. You can see how long and detailed this is, and I'm sure that there's a lot more improvement, but I go into a lot of details about what's going on, what needs to happen, the details of the game. And actually it did a pretty good job. There were still a few errors. I got more with Sonnet, although it was prettier. And I shot a whole separate video on this, but if I just do this right now, it'll actually go out and start executing things, and we can see that run. So this will take a while. There's some other details with Cursor. Overall, I think it is really cool. It's a better deal overall than Windsurf, even though I feel like Windsurf is a better product, but their pricing is just incredibly stupidly expensive. Usually I'll just accept this when it's done, but it's still generating. It might take a while. Another thing with the thinking model of Gemini and just Gemini in general is there are rate limits that they're still putting on this. So sometimes it will pause for a while, and you just have to wait. And if it sits there for a while, just tell it continue. Just put in here continue. Sometimes it'll actually get itself going here in a few minutes. In this case, it didn't continue, which is pretty weird. So I'm going to go ahead and accept, and then I'm going to say continue. Again, there's some randomness to the way the models work, and so you don't always get the same input or output. Sometimes what you do is you just restore the checkpoint and try again with maybe the same thing, maybe the same input, or maybe you're like, okay, this is part of how it didn't miss this part, so let me make it extra clear on this part. There's a lot of nuance and testing here, but it's really cool when it's really fun when you get it to work, especially with stuff like I never ever want to have to write a regex statement, and I don't ever have to. That's great. I don't think that's a very useful skill to know, although some people might argue with me. I'd say one of the things that it does struggle with is debugging, and I think that's just a general issue with all the models. It has it tends to hallucinate bugs, or it tends to find the first indication of any sort of possibility for a bug, but not like really fully check that in a way that makes sense. And so it'll start suggesting and fixing bugs that don't exist, and sometimes that's where it sometimes paints itself into a corner that is pretty bad. I think really understanding how to code and a lot of like the full stack stuff and in terms of security is incredibly helpful. So don't just think that you're going to come in here based on this and know how to prompt it directly, because it's a little bit like if you think about you're the senior developer or the mid-level developer and they're the junior developer. If you're not a developer at all, you don't know what to tell it. I'm not as good at JavaScript, so I have a little bit more challenge telling it what to do with JavaScript. I don't know as much about full stack, so I wouldn't trust myself to develop from A to Z without doing my own research, and maybe I can have a conversation with it, and that's good. So we can just click accept all, and we can see it's probably done. I don't think it's necessarily going to work perfectly right out of the gate because I've already done this exact prompt, but it created it. It followed the instructions at least the last few times I've done it. Expect to find issues, and also I think it is really valuable to be able to sometimes go into the code yourself, even if it's only 5% of the time, and make the change yourself. Find and identify the real challenge and try to work to understand your own code. And I know that is hard when it can write thousands of lines of code very quickly. You don't necessarily want to review them all, but maybe you can actually be able to navigate to a key place instead of telling it what to do. Sometimes it's actually faster than prompting it, and better, because then you can kind of control what's happening, because the model does do weird things. It will recode bin bugs, as I pointed out, and that can be very annoying. Or sometimes it does super weird things that make absolutely no sense. Like one time I was coding in multiple models for it to use, where I was inputting different OpenAI models, and it hard-coded somewhere in a weird random place to switch up the models. Like if I put in this model, it was switching to that model. It did that on a few ones, and it was incredibly hard to find, and I couldn't understand what was going on. That was really annoying, and why it did that made absolutely no sense. And it's gonna do that. And so you got to be prepared for that. And so the more you're able to actually look in and get a feel for the code and do your own testing and not have it build too much at once. Like already right here is quite a bit for it to build. This is probably the extent of the most of what I'd want it to build. And if you think you're going to have it build like a SaaS application, you know, in 1 or 2 shots that's fully functional and doesn't have any bugs and doesn't have any security issues, I don't think we're there yet, and I think it'll be a while before we're there. I think you'll still need to have some amount of expertise, or at least do your own research and try to think through. If you don't know all those things, try to brainstorm with the models themselves. What are some potential security issues? How can I prompt you this? How can I set up a project that reduces these security issues? You can have that conversation right here in Cursor. Oh, it looks they're constantly updating it, so this is kind of nice. They update this. I think I get this message every other day or something, which is pretty cool. So anyway, what do you think? Have you used Cursor before? Do you have any tips that I missed? I'm sure that there's a lot of other cool stuff that you can do with Cursor that I haven't seen. I use Cursor almost every day, and I really like it. I think it's really cool, and the ability, the time saving when it works, that it is almost like magic, is pretty cool. So I'm curious if you think that's the case as well for you. If you like this video, please like and subscribe for more content like this. Thanks, appreciate you. Have a great day. Bye.